Last summer, as the COVID pandemic raged throughout the United States, people who still read the New York Times began to notice something very strange happening at the paper. Hundreds of articles that had appeared there going back nearly a decade suddenly vanished. They disappeared. There was no way to find them. Nothing like this had ever happened. The New York Times considers itself, very self-consciously, a living historical record. The paper maintains meticulous, searchable archives going back to before the Civil War, to 1851. Yet last August, a huge number of articles just disappeared. So what was in those articles? We know the answer because a handful of history-minded readers preserved them when they first appeared. Every one of them was a propaganda piece paid for by the Chinese Communist Party, all designed to look like news articles. You're seeing one of them on your screen right now. It reads, "China Watch. Diaoyu Islands belong to China." That's the headline. Now, why would the New York Times, America's paper of record, print propaganda from a totalitarian regime and pretend it was a news article? Well, for money. Financial filings show the New York Times made more than $100,000 a month from this garbage. Those payments were not disclosed at the time. They were hidden from New York Times readers. They were only uncovered after the fact by the Washington Free Beacon. And the Times wasn't the only news organization that did this, that took money from the Chinese Communist Party. Since 2016, the Chinese Communist Party paid $20 million to outlets like the Los Angeles Times, the Chicago Tribune, and the Washington Post. Twitter, which now operates as a publisher, also received checks from the Chinese government totaling hundreds of thousands of dollars. Now, these arrangements, as we said, continued for years, and then last summer, they stopped abruptly. The New York Times tried to hide the evidence that any of it ever happened. But why? The New York Times won't say when we asked. "We do not discuss revenue beyond what is in our quarterly earnings report," a spokesman told us this morning. So we kept looking. But first, here's some context for what the New York Times did. This is what mainstream news coverage in the United States looked like for most of last year. As you watch it, see if you can tell the difference between this and what you might see on Chinese state television.
The president referred to the coronavirus as a, quote, foreign virus. And I think it's going to it's going to come across to a lot of Americans as smacking of xenophobia.
Xenophobic wartime Trump, where he thinks the only path now is to basically declare the virus public enemy number one, paint it in somewhat racist terms.
The xenophobia and the racism in outbreak is such a common thing, and it is incredibly dangerous. It is problematic, and it is scary, and I just really want to call that out.
Why do you keep calling this the Chinese virus? Why do you keep using this? A lot of people say it's racist.
It's not racist at all, no, not at all. It comes from China. That's why.
So as this virus emerged from central China to kill Americans in huge numbers and people throughout the West, news organizations in this country made the same aggressively pro-China noises, almost all of them. Politico, for example, hired a full-time China shill called David Wertheim to write articles with headlines like this, quote, "The verdict is in. China has outperformed while the once respected American system has disastrously faltered." Now, as you read that, once again, you wonder, how is that different from what the Chinese would write about themselves? Well, it's not different. The American media were especially hysterical on the question of where the coronavirus came from. Under no circumstances were you allowed to entertain the possibility that that coronavirus, COVID-19, could have come from a lab in Wuhan, China. That was a conspiracy theory. All the footage you're about to see is from early 2020.
Former CDC Director Robert Redfield told our own Sanjay Gupta in a new CNN documentary that he believes COVID-19 originated from a lab in Wuhan, even though obviously, there has been no formal evidence to support the theory.
You know, the lab leak theory doesn't seem like a plausible theory unless you aggregate the biggest collection of coronaviruses and put them in a lab.
The theory that the virus originated in a lab in Wuhan, China. But tonight, Dr. Anthony Fauci tells National Geographic that, quote, "This virus could not have been artificially or deliberately manipulated."
Both scientists and the U.S. intelligence community agree that this coronavirus was not man-made. That is not a possibility. It came from a natural source. It didn't come from a lab. A lot of people on the right love that phrase, escape from the lab, because it sounds like something from a Marvel movie or a comic book. It sounds like they're talking about a man-made virus that China was weaponizing that got out of control.
So the Rachel Maddow impersonator didn't believe it. But it wasn't just dumb people on cable news. That was Anthony Fauci, who was in charge of the U.S. government's COVID response. That was Scott Gottlieb, who ran the FDA. These are people in positions of authority, who are respected as scientists, whose word carries great moral weight. And they all lied. The New York Times led the way on this. A recent piece on unheard.com deconstructs the New York Times' role in the propaganda effort on behalf of China. Beginning in the winter of last year, at the very beginning of the outbreak of COVID, the Times confidently dismissed the lab leak hypothesis as a, quote, fringe theory. In other words, only lunatics believe it. The New York Times' reporter called the theory, quote, the kind of conspiracy once reserved for the tinfoil hatters. You're a nutcase if you think it's possible. Then a few weeks later, the paper published an op-ed by Peter Daszak, the virologist paid by Tony Fauci to experiment on bat coronaviruses. Talk about a conflict of interest. So Daszak, needless to say, denied that the virus could have come from any lab he was funding. He knew better. Instead, Daszak blamed the pandemic, and we're quoting now, on road building, deforestation, land clearing, and agricultural development. In other words, he blamed it on poor people. As 2020 continued, lies like this became less and less tenable. They were more obviously untrue. People started to notice that a level 4 virology lab, one of few in the world, in Wuhan, was conducting dangerous experiments on bat coronaviruses with fewer safeguards than typical dentist's office has in the United States. They also noticed that Tony Fauci was helping to pay for those experiments. And that's when the Times decided it had to delete those articles from its archives. Two high-level employees at the New York Times confirmed to The Spectator in London that the paper stopped any investigation into evidence that the coronavirus had emerged from that lab in Wuhan. Quote, in early 2020, said one whistleblower, I suggested to a senior editor at the paper that we investigate the origins of COVID-19. I was told it was dangerous to run a piece about the origins of the coronavirus. There was resistance to running anything that could suggest that COVID-19 was man-made or had leaked accidentally from a lab. It was untouchable everywhere, said another Times source to The Spectator. The fact that Trump embraced it, of course, also made it a no-go. According to the whistleblowers, though, the biggest factor wasn't politics. The biggest factor was the fact that the New York Times was taking money from the communist Chinese government. So they killed a story which, by the way, was not a conspiracy theory at all, but entirely real. The House Foreign Affairs Committee just released a report suggesting the coronavirus first escaped from that lab in Wuhan much earlier than we thought, way back in mid-September of 2019. Now, at the time, athletes from around the world were in Wuhan. They arrived several weeks later to compete in international games. Many of them brought COVID home with them. Now, why didn't we know this until now? Well, because of a massive and coordinated lying campaign on behalf of the government of China. The Foreign Affairs Committee identifies Peter Daszak, who, irony of ironies, is still, by the way, used by the Washington Post as an authority on the origin of COVID. They describe him as, quote, the public face of a Chinese Communist Party disinformation campaign designed to suppress public discussion about a potential lab leak, end quote. The committee discovered evidence that the Wuhan Institute of Virology sought bids for 2 contracts in September of 2019. That was around the time the coronavirus began to spread. One of those contracts was for something called a, quote, security service procurement project, and it was issued on September 12th. Now, September 12th was the very same day that the Wuhan lab abruptly took its entire virus database offline. Then, just 4 days later, the Wuhan lab announced another contract competition. This time, the contract was for a $600 million effort to completely renovate the lab's air conditioning system. Now, why would the Wuhan Institute of Virology want to replace its air conditioning system? Well, just like the Times dispatches from the Beijing Bureau, all evidence of those contracts has now been wiped from the website of China's finance ministry. What does this add up to? John Ratcliffe is the former director of national intelligence in this country. He just wrote an op-ed on FoxNews.com that includes this assessment, quote, I had access to all of the U.S. government's most sensitive intelligence related to the pandemic. My informed opinion is that the lab leak theory isn't just a possibility. At the very least, it is more like a probability, if not very close to a certainty.